Well, hello, everyone. I'm Josette Sheeran, Executive Chair of the McCain Institute for International Leadership, and welcome to this episode of our Authors and Insights Book Talk series, where we interview the authors of important newly released books on American politics, policy, and leadership. It's our intention to engage you in a dialogue that affirms the importance of character-driven leadership and America's leadership in the world. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Cindy McCain about her newly released intimate memoir, Stronger: Courage, Hope, and Humor in My Life with John McCain. In this book, Cindy writes of her nearly 4 decades as the wife of Senator John McCain and their triumphs and struggles on the front lines of American public service, love, and in the arena fighting for the values that have been their guiding light through it all. Central to her story is her role as a mother to their 4 children, Megan, co-host of The View, sons Jack and Jimmy, both serving in the US military, and Bridget, who's studying at university. I've known Cindy as a humanitarian and business leader. She serves as chair of the McCain Institute. She's a champion against the scourge of human trafficking of the world's most vulnerable. She's been a champion of the hungry and those trapped in war zones around the world. And she's chairman of her family's business, Hensley Beverage Company. While she's always traveled the world, including to war zones and beyond, she joins us today from her beloved home base in Arizona. Cindy, first of all, happy birthday. And I know this is also the week of your wedding anniversary. Yeah. So that brings up, I'm sure, a lot of memories, but we're so happy to be with you today.
Thank you.
So Cindy, I just wanted to start by saying I've so enjoyed particularly listening to the Audible version of your book. It's your warmth, the humanity, the stories come to life through that. But your book is so profoundly and beautifully vulnerable. It's also deeply courageous for that reason. And the reviews that I've read on Amazon and beyond all talk about how meaningful it has been to people. So you've talked honestly and openly about your personal challenges, your family challenges. So I'd just like to start with you saying what was the most difficult part of this book to write and what was the most fun part?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Josette. I appreciate the time and I just want to commend you for all the good work you're doing at the Institute. We're so joyous to have you with us, more importantly, but we respect and love you for everything that you have done through your years serving our country and serving the world. The most difficult part of the book to write for me, I believe, was probably the obvious thing, the challenge that we had with John's brain cancer, and then ultimately he passed. It was difficult because for the obvious reasons that he passed, but also to what I wanted to explain to people is really how he did it his way and how we did it our way, and against a lot of what people thought we should be doing, which was more aggressive treatment for him. But he had chosen not to do that. He had chosen to do the recommended treatments, and then really just wanted to be up north at our ranch and pass in the kind of beauty and grandeur that he's always enjoyed up there. And that's indeed what he did. And so it was hard for me to write, though, because it was it was my vision, obviously, of what occurred, but it was also, I think, just the realization for me that he really is gone. And I know that sounds perhaps a little strange, but after he passed, I went straight back to work. I didn't miss a beat. I kept on going. And so when COVID hit, which is during the time that I wrote this book, it was, for me, it was a very cathartic experience because all of a sudden I had to stop, like we all did, and begin writing this, but also begin to grieve. And because I really hadn't done much grieving, and grief is a very personal experience. I know you know that, and it's also something that no one else can tell you how to do. So for me, this was a process and also an experience that was very good for me in the long run. But the whole idea of writing about his death obviously was the most difficult part of it for me. The most fun part was describing his humor and the kind of humor that we shared, which was sometimes kind of twisted. It was fun. It was the kind of humor that we, that was how you get through things. That was, John always used it. He learned to use it when he was in prison. And of course, from there, our family always had a very humorous side to it. So anyone that spent any time with us knew that. And so I think writing about the humor and writing about his free spirit in many ways was what I enjoyed the most. And me having a front row seat, not just to him, but a front row seat to history and in the life that we shared. So I loved that part of it. And it was a fun book to write for me. It was really, really a fun experience.
Well, it struck me with the testimonials at the time of John's death, how many people spoke about his humor and how much it lifted them up through whatever battles they were going through, even if they were on different sides of the aisle. And a little bit later, I want to explore with you partisanship and division and tribalism in America. You boldly open the book with a piece of that humor. And I have to say, even reading it, you could feel the tension with the strong will of your husband wanting to go to a security conference in Italy after his diagnosis and all the doctors saying no, he couldn't have that pressure on his brain, him insisting, and you somehow using humor to stay with him, break the ice, and carry you through the trip.
That was definitely John McCain for sure. As you know,
I don't know if you want to recount your exchange on the airplane, but
the whole family had been after him not to go because it was strongly recommended that he not fly that far, not fly at all, actually, and not fly that far. And as I described in the book, we're in the air and I'm I guess I'm sitting there perched looking at him like, at any moment he's going to explode. And that's when we had the discussion about, well, he had a dust buster and he'd clean it up if he had to. So John always could level the most tense moments. And it was a good thing because it was something that we, as we look back on it, it was the best part of it all, was this humor.
And what strikes me throughout the book is often his jokes, he was the target of them, right? Yeah. It was self-deprecating and humble. One thing that really strikes me in the book, Cindy, is everyone knows that John McCain was a fighter. He fought when he was in prison in Vietnam. He fought for our country. He fought for the things he believed in, even if he had to break parties, even if it didn't serve his so-called political interest. You're a fighter. You're a fighter. And there are moments in the book where Cindy the fighter comes out, many moments, including when you confronted human trafficking in the world and would meet with law enforcement officials who said, you don't have to worry, we'll protect these young girls as young as 7 years old who are being trafficked, trying to work with the NFL to deal with this issue. When insurance companies denied John chemotherapy, and out came Cindy the bear. But I'm not sure the world quite knows the story of you're being a fighter, but some of those what comes to mind. And you also talk about women not having the self-confidence sometimes to stand up to these things. Right. And that comes through the book as well. What did it take you to, really come forth as a fighter for what you believed in?
I think a lot of that had to do, it's when you're young, you're vulnerable, but you're also very wary of in many cases of being expressive because you're not sure what people are going to think of you. And as you know, the older that you get, and I'm a mother and now a grandmother, you gain this confidence that's obviously experiential in many ways, but it's also the confidence that you realize that you do have a voice, at least in my case, that I do have a voice, and it's okay to express it, even if people disagree. And also to be able to fight for what you believe in. And I found that popped out of me when I was trying to get Bridget home from Bangladesh. And she had, as the story goes, I know many of you know, but I discovered her in an orphanage, a Mother Teresa's orphanage in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And she had a serious cleft palate, and she was 10 weeks old, and they were doing the best they could to feed her, but she needed the surgeries, all the things that you would need for a child that had such a disability. And I realized I could take her home. I could get her help. It was easy for me. I had the connections. I had the ability. But I was faced with, about the time we're supposed to leave Bangladesh to come home, I was faced with a group of men, I'll put it that way. It was their health department, or health secretary, I guess, their version of it. And they called me in to talk to them because they weren't sure that, they weren't sure what was going to happen and whether this should even happen. And the entire meeting was conducted in Hindi. And of course, I don't speak Hindi. I only speak English. And at the end, and finally I said, may I ask what's going on, in English, obviously. And the secretary himself said, well, we can do these surgeries and we can fix her here in Bangladesh. And both you and I know that little girls in many of those countries are substandard. They're treated as if they're not human beings all too often, and they're not cared for, or if they are cared for, it's in a substandard way. And so I just, we were under the gun trying to get to the airport, et cetera. And I just, at that time, slammed my fist on the table. I don't know where that came from, but I slammed my fist on the table and excuse my language, and said, then God damn it, do it. Why haven't you done it? And of course, at that moment, they started stamping everything to get me out of the room, because I was angry. And I'd never done anything like that before, especially confront an appointed member of a government in such a way. But it was for the defense of a child, a little girl that had no defense at all. And it was at that point, I really believe, I found a voice, at least a voice that was starting to come out. And in that, of course, was able to get Bridget home. And of course, then she became a part of our family, which was not the plan at all. But talk about a test of a marriage is when you come home with an infant and introduce the infant to your husband at the airport. And he was very happy. I mean, he wasn't really surprised in me at all. He knew me too well. But I know you know this, but it's a voice that, you discovered this, at least I did. And the older I get, I think the louder it gets too.
Mm-hmm. It struck me also in those experiences you had, your own humanitarian awakening. Mm-hmm. And you write often about being exposed to the vulnerabilities that so many people face in the world, particularly girls and women. And seeing that, I saw that directly in you when I headed up the United Nations World Food Program, the world's largest humanitarian organization. Yes. The U.S., I think, still supports about 1 out of every 2 starving person in the world who gets a meal. And so U.S. compassion, but you took it upon yourself to come visit, to understand, to visit those sites and really champion that cause. And you did it with human trafficking. You did it with what struck me in the book is I never knew your story of how you came to care. And that awakening, I think that's what can help change the world, right? To create these kind of partnerships to help lift people out of the situations they're in. Yeah. But could you just talk about that? Because you do have a humanitarian heart. And I've seen it now for many years, but that part of it, right? It's the anger and then it's the action.
Right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you asking that question. Humanitarian action, as you know, and what I tell people that say to me, I really like to get involved. What should I do? And the first thing I tell them is you have to do it from your heart. Something has to move you. Don't do it because you think it's the cool thing to do or because you should be doing it, but do it because your heart tells you to do it. And that's exactly what happened in me. It was again, motherhood enlightens so many women in so many ways, but it was not. A lot of people accuse me of having guilt, kind of an American well-to-do woman that really could be doing other things. And it was guilt. It was not guilt at all for me. It was about the utter disbelief that other parts of the world could actually forget their people the way that they do and treat them the way that they do. So it was maybe a little anger in there that things were occurring that number one should not be occurring, and number two, people weren't paying attention to. And so I think in many of the cases, and again, I tell people, something will move you in your life. Something will touch your heart in a way you can't describe it, but you just know you have to do something. And I'm no different than anybody else. That's what happened to me. And just the shock and reality of what goes on or does not go on around the world. And I explained one time about having been in a food riot in Congo. And it was then Zaire. It was during the genocide. And I'd never seen anything like that, the desperation. I'd seen desperation, but I'd never seen the absolute animalistic behavior that occurs when people are hungry. Just simply, and because I've never been hungry, but I understand what it can do to a human being after having seen that. And also understanding that so much of this takes place at gunpoint. And so I think for me, it was the kind of experience that changes your life. And it's not just what you see and what you do, but it's how you process it and how you work with it. And so for me, it was more about beginning that journey. And it is a journey. Humanitarian action is a journey for people. And what I tell people, you may not be able to or may not want to go overseas or do any of the things that I've done or been around. But there's humanitarian action that needs to take place in your own neighborhood, human trafficking being one of them. And so I think it's just the bottom line, in simple terms, it's your heart. It's follow your heart. And that's exactly what happened to me. Nothing more complicated than that. But I will say, when people describe me as a humanitarian, that's the finest compliment in my mind that they can give me, because if I'm a humanitarian, then I've done exactly what I wanted to do and where I want to be, because I think it's a wonderful, wonderful description of somebody. I really do.
Well, what struck me is you're a humanitarian of action, because also what comes through in your book is how even doing small things can make such a difference in an individual life. Yeah. And the encouragement, and how you dragged your friends on your birthday parties each year out to the front lines of the world and, expose them. This is your way of having fun, is, learning more and being out there. But one thing that came through to me also is just your love of Arizona, because you started your fight against trafficking there. And it's interesting to try to balance the profound needs that you see in the world. And sometimes America, seems much better off than the things you see, but not for getting home, which you were just talking about.
Yeah, they're not. It's you bring up a really good point, because in the first thing I wanted to do when I realized and realized that I could do something with regards to human trafficking and really make a difference, of course, I wanted to head out of the country. And the stark realization is that it's a horrific crime that happens right here. It's right in your own neighborhoods. And when I tell people that, they just assume it's someplace in Asia or someplace in Africa. And to tell them, you're going to find it at your local Circle K, you're going to find it at your airport, you're going to find it on the streets. And it's about teaching people to look with better eyes. And so that's, in my opinion, has been part of this journey, but it's been the most important part of it, which is maintaining and taking care of your own local community first. And that's where I started on this issue of human trafficking. And now, of course, we we work nationally and internationally on the issue, which is it's an important part of trying to make sure, keep reminding many governments and reminding many countries and reminding my own government and my own country not to give up on human trafficking, that we can fix this, but it's going to take all of us to do it.
Mm-hmm. You know, Cindy, I think many people might be surprised a bit by the Cindy McCain I meet in this book. You're gorgeous. We're a dazzling couple together. You lived a life of power and privilege in many ways. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, you can't go 5 pages in the book without realizing that throughout your life and your life with John McCain, the two of you had to fight so many battles. Mm-hmm. And they were everything from the deeply personal to the deeply global, mm-hmm. to the front lines of American politics. Mm-hmm. And one thing that, you know, really moved me, and I can see moved some of the reviewers, is that you wrote very honestly about falling into the iron grip, as you call it, of mm-hmm. opioid addiction. Mm-hmm. And then needing to break that grip mm-hmm. and hiding it from everyone who loved you because you mm-hmm. were ashamed of it. That shame and that vulnerability that you express in the book, I think, can help people, because mm-hmm. for someone as public as you've been, to put that all out there. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that, because I think there is mm-hmm. such a stigma, and it is a mental health, it's a health crisis, it's all of those things. Mm-hmm. But just to talk about, was that difficult to lay out there like that? And what would you say to people who are struggling with addiction now?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, for me, it was very cathartic to lay it out, because it was a very publicized problem when I had it, but for all the wrong reasons. You know, in the earlier years, you and I are the generation where we've experienced the early side of medicine with regards to its treatment of women, and of course now the later years where we are not just treated well, but we're treated as women for women. And so the beginning of all this in those days, and I'm not blaming anybody, let's be very clear. There's no blame to be had here except me on my part. I did this, but it was the kind of thing where you would go in as a woman. And of course I had kids all over the place. And I had my husband with a stressful job. And so when I said I had back pain, which I did, I'd blown 2 discs, didn't know it at the time. But I had back pain, or I had some kind of pain. It was easy. They give you a bottle of 100 pills and then also say, well, go home and have a drink while you're at it. It's just stress. And it was kind of a way to kind of scoot you out the door, because people either, number one, didn't understand what was going on with you, or number 2, really didn't want to deal with you. And so that happened to me. It happened to me a number of times. It was too easy to get the pills, because that's what they did. That was their practice in those days. And as it moved on, and I realized that I I was going down this whirlpool of a rabbit hole, and I didn't know how to get out. I knew I had to. I had to figure this out. But the shame of it, as you mentioned, and the shame of me telling my husband, who was a war hero and someone who, you have to, from my eyes, war hero, had been a POW, he'd survived everything. He was this amazing person, to tell him that I was weak and that I made a mistake. And that was very, very, very hard for me to do. But when I did it, I found not only did my husband care for me very deeply, he did, but that he made sure that we processed through this whole thing together. And he was by my side for all of this. So I underestimated him. And I also underestimated in some degree my own strength, because when I stopped, my parents came to me to talk to me, and I realized I stopped cold turkey. I never picked up another pill. I never, none of that. I just simply stopped. And then, of course, it became public. And the public portion of it, there's always shame involved, but the public portion of it was a misunderstanding media who didn't really grasp the fact that this is a disease. It's not a choice. It's a disease. And then their shaming of you that somehow you're weak or you're a spoiled rich kid and drugs, and the categorization and the cartoons and all the things that go with that. That, in my opinion, done to anybody else could have made them kill themselves. I mean, it was that kind of pressure. And that's what some of the media did not understand at that time. I know now it's much different because it is a disease and they talk about it as a disease. But the kind of shaming that they did me, and I'll mention the kind of shaming that they've done to Hunter Biden, is not fair. Hunter's struggling, and he's struggling to stay clean and stay sober. And the media just continues after him. That's really damaging. And it's also very dangerous. And so I'm not glad this happened to me by any stretch, but it made me a better parent. It made me a better person. And I think it made me a better wife as a result of it. But I would never want anyone to go through what I did. And it is an epidemic in the United States. It really is. And it's something that I hope that people gain from this book. The understanding that if I can do that, then they can do that. That it's okay to admit that you've got a problem. It's okay to admit that you've been weak. And there's no shame in it because there's help out there. And that's what I want people to take from it. I hope, anyway. I hope they do.
Yes. And there's help beyond going cold turkey, right?
Right. Yeah,
There's
absolutely. I would never suggest that to anybody.
Really help. Yes.
Right.
True grit you had in that. So you're going through all of this and these experiences, and you're on the public stage, kind of on a tightrope. And you speak in the book about the Nancy Reagan gaze. And to me, that opens the topic of what it's like to be a political spouse in America, particularly a political wife, what you're expected to do, and how you put your own expectation to be perfect. And maybe many others have the same expectation. And also your sense of failure anytime you weren't perfect. For John, your sense of dealing with your own guilt about that. But could you talk about the Nancy Reagan gaze and how does one deal with that as they go through life's challenge?
Well, when I began this with John, this was 1980. We got married in 1980, and then by 1981, he was out and running for Congress. And I put on myself, I put a great deal of pressure. So a lot of this was self-imposed in terms of being perfect and being, and the largest fear is always for the spouse is you never want to be the source of any criticism. You're there to support and not be a part of the story, et cetera. That, of course, things are different now. And so anytime that I felt like I brought criticism onto John, it was devastating for me. The guilt and all the things. So the Nancy Reagan stare, we coined that. A lot of us, the political spouses in those days, we coined it because she was amazing at looking at Ron and really just, it was fascinating to watch. And so the joke was, and the reality of it was, the rest of us were kind of expected to do the same thing. And the truth is, life's not perfect. There are days when I maybe didn't want to do that, or I wanted to be honest with him in terms of the kind of job that he had done that day. It's all those things combined. And for a political spouse in those days, perfection was absolutely part of it. Perfection was necessary in many ways because of how you were viewed. Quite frankly, a spouse was viewed as kind of being vapid and being just a sidekick, someone kind of that could be in the room and be there, but don't say anything, can't do that. And of course, that wasn't me. And so when we made the choice to raise our children at home in Arizona and not live in Washington, D.C., I didn't live there. It made some ripples, and it was absolutely the best decision we could have made because it was not just for the children, but it was for the well-being of our marriage as well. The kind of life that can happen in Washington, D.C. can be very damning. And so for me, the best thing I ever did, and probably the first part of maybe me becoming a stronger, more outspoken person, was saying we're going to raise our kids at home. And John, of course, was in perfect agreement with that. But the Nancy Reagan gaze, that was we all strive to have that. It was, she was perfect
Very
at it. The rest of us were very imperfect. So,
Well, here you are today. You write in the book about how politics can bring out the most brutal side of people.
yeah.
And I don't think in this interview we need to recount, it's well known, the attacks on your family from President Trump. It didn't start there during the when John McCain ran for president and George Bush was running. There was an attack on your daughter Bridget,
yeah.
and very racially motivated and very untrue, deeply hurtful. What strikes me is what John and you have symbolized, and John symbolized in the Senate, was he held country first before the partisanship. And in the book, you talk about how for him, friendship was always first, and then he was happy to disagree and fight the battles.
Right.
But there was that friendship and respect there. And if he was wrong, he admitted it. And I think you hear testimony after testimony. I was at his funeral. It was so moving to see people from every side of the political spectrum really acknowledging that. And what I'd like to ask you is, you talk a little bit about forgiveness, because in order to move beyond that, it has to be there, and it's not easy, but also for the United States right now, in this terrible, divisive political environment we're in, your thoughts of what would John be doing now?
Yeah.
What could we be doing now to move beyond that?
Well, I can't. I wish I had a nickel for every time I asked, what would John think on things like this? But the truth of it is, John was part of an era where in politics they would fight. Of course they did. They disagreed on things. And I'll start with Tip O'Neill and come all the way, through Ted Kennedy, et cetera. But it was an era where they would fight and disagree and compromise, more importantly, and work across the aisle. And then it was never personal. Nothing was ever personal. There were no personal attacks. You didn't do it for yourself. It was for the good of the country. And so they did walk off the floor arm in arm, go have a drink or whatever they were going to do that night. But that's the way it should be, because it was for the right reasons. It was country first. But we have an era now where it's not only become very personal, but it's become very damaging. And I think John, at this particular point, if I could just speculate on what he would be doing, I know he'd be very disappointed in what's happening and what has happened. It's the lack of civility, which is a large part of who John was civil. You could have civil discourse and civil disagreement, but it was never personal. I think nowadays we're faced with a cadre of people within both the House and the Senate that believe the only way to get things done is to attack and to try to harm somebody or try to harm their reputation or something like that. And I don't know how we got here, other than the leadership at the time helped drive us there. You speak about the ugly side of politics, and yes, we've experienced the ugly side of politics, very much so. But what we knew is that John and I, in many ways, were fair game. What the harsh part of this was is that our children were not. And so at no time should anybody's kids, not just mine, but anybody's kids, be brought into any kind of a political campaign unless they choose to be there. And so that was the part, I think, for me that was the hardest to swallow, was how personal it had come. It had gotten through the campaign, but to take it out on a child. But with that said, John and I knew there were going to be bumps along the road. The one bump we didn't anticipate was having to explain to our daughter some years later that no, the president did not hate her because she was Black. And that was the question she actually asked me, was why the president hated her, and was it because she was Black, and which is crushing. And what I like to remind any candidate or any group that I speak to, words have consequences. And so choose them wisely, especially when you're trying to disagree with your opponent. John was a unique man. As you said, there were people from across every aisle, every country, everywhere that were there, because he was honest, and the honesty and his integrity and his civility were who he was. And we're missing that right now. We're missing it. I think eventually, I believe in the good sense of the American people that we'll swing back to it. But right now, unless the voting electorate out here decides we're going to make some changes, we may be in this mess for a while. That's a whole lot of things in one question, but you're muted.
One thing
No problem.
at the McCain Institute is championed the mavericks of the world.
Right.
John stood up for that lonely voice somewhere in the world who was making a point that no one wanted to hear but needed to be heard.
Yeah.
John was a maverick. What was it like to live with him? How did that manifest? Did he read different things? You talked about his love of history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he said he was deeply allergic to groupthink.
Mm-hmm. Very deeply allergic to groupthink. He was, John was unique in that, his life experience was like none other. So you can't compare him to anything or compare his life to anything, because it wasn't. I mean, it was completely different, and it was, as you know, was challenged in so many ways. He read, he was a voracious reader. And that was one of the things that when he came home from prison that he said he missed the most was that he hadn't been able to read. So he was a voracious reader, he always had 2 or 3 books going at once. And I think part of that did instill this maverick attitude, because he would read different things and different ideas. And it was a good thing. I mean, I loved the maverick in him. In fact, when he wasn't a maverick, sometimes I kind of missed it. So what he wanted to represent was what you just mentioned, not a group think, but not doing what you think somebody else might want you to do, but doing what's right. And the one of the lessons that we teach our next generation leaders at the Institute is about the right decision may not be the easiest decision. And those are the kinds of things that you have to learn. If you're going to be a good leader, those are the kinds of things you have to respect and learn from. And that was definitely John. I know many people look up to him for that reason. And I also don't think there was anything more. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think that was never more eloquently discussed than when John gave his concession speech during the Obama, during the 2008 race. His concession speech spoke volumes about who he was as a man and the kind of person he would have been and was as a leader. And those are the kinds of lessons that we learned from him, from his maverick attitude. It was great.
What part of that speech are you recalling that really struck you as different from maybe we're hearing?
Well, if you watch the video of it, he said in the speech, we have a new president, and it is up to us as Americans to support that president and give him every opportunity to succeed. And of course, there were boos that came from the audience, and John reminded everyone, this is about our country, not about me. And those are the kinds of lessons that I know our kids learned from him. And I hope the country did too, because I wish more people would review some of the things that he said and wrote about and spoke about, because his ideals were really pure and simple. He was all about serving his country. And that was, I think, the one element that I know we all miss now. I certainly do. And also miss because of the impact that he would have on other people within the Senate and the House.
And to that point, speaking of legacy, how to keep that alive, because clearly
that's a big job.
You said he was larger than life, and indeed he is. And indeed, many people say they hear his voice every day, on these principles. Mm-hmm. But what are the main areas that you feel are important to keep that legacy alive?
Yeah. Well, the most important part, of course, is the kinds of things that he represented and who he was as a man. And those are things that you can read about and learn about. But what I want to make sure is that his legacy lives for those reasons, but also that kids learn from it and learn what, the kinds of things that make you a good leader and make it important that you do lead, especially as Americans. We are right now, I mean, I know you've seen it, but we have been faced with a country, we were always the ones that they looked up to. When they saw the Americans coming, they knew things were going to be okay. And that simply isn't the case. Certainly during the last 4 years, it was not the case at all. And it's time that we regain our front and center activity on the world stage. And John's legacy can be a large part of that if we listen to what he taught and what he learned and what he spoke about, et cetera. And I want people to know that. Being challenged with keeping a larger than life man's legacy alive is a little daunting for me. And so I work very hard to make sure that who he was and what he represented stays alive. And it's hard though. I want to make sure I do it right. So I have to rely on some good advice from good people like you.
Well, your perfectionist tendencies come out in the book, I must say. But, it's easy to lose in this really epic story of this life and your life together, that this was the love of your life.
Yeah.
It's your anniversary week.
Absolutely.
And I have to say, one of the most touching parts of the book for me was the story you recount of being in the South Pacific on the island where John's grandfather and father had met, the only place in battle they had met that had been such a place of heroism, written about by Michener in South Pacific. And your daughter Megan being upset because you were rough camping, I guess, not glamping. And creatures were coming in and stealing the food, but that you and John snuggling together that night, and he hummed a song. Could you tell us that story just as we close? Because it captures his sense of adventure, his sense of life.
Yeah.
And
we did do a lot of those kinds of rugged things together as a family. And it was good because we saw parts of the world that we never would have seen. And usually the things that we did do was family history tours. So a large part, of course, having to do with John's family. And so it was just the kind of thing that when you've had, it's the end of the day and one or two kids have been upset, and it's what family is all about and what life is all about. And it just, at the end of the day, John always either had a little story to tell or would hum or sing even, and that's indeed what he did. And it was just the kind of thing that will always remain in my mind, that there we were, we were thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from home. And yet the most important thing to me and to John as well were these four little human beings and the two of us. And that was what meant the world. That was what our life was all about, not about all the grandeur of being in the Senate or being, doing the things that we do, but it was about those quiet moments and those simple things with our kids and our family. And yes, he did hum. He was a terrible hummer, a terrible singer, and so was I. So
and I think he hummed a particular song from South Pacific, you said.
Oh, yeah, Some Enchanted Evening, yes. His favorite song. Oh my gosh, yeah, that was indeed. And he would try on occasion to sing it, which is really a hoot. So, but yeah, that was his favorite book and also his favorite, I guess, musical, because he was able to see it on Broadway. So he loved it, and it's a beautiful piece. And it was and we were there where Michener wrote the book. So it was great.
Well, your book opened with a song, Frank Sinatra, I Did It My Way.
My Way.
Was the closing song, the closing moment in John's Life.
Life. Yeah.
And that song, what struck me in that song is when you wrote that he said every night should be an enchanted evening.
Mm-hmm.
And
he meant that too. Yeah, he really meant that. He was, John lived his life on his own terms, and what he taught us to do, he taught us how to live and how to be good people and try to do our best, serve our country. But he also taught us how to die. And in watching his grace and his strength and his honor during the course of that time was something obviously that I will never forget, and I know our family won't either. And yes, he did pass with his music, his playlist going, and it was Frank Sinatra was on singing "My Way," and the hawk that he loved so dearly was perched literally on the roof on a limb. And it was just John was a unique human being, and even to the very end, it was his way completely. And I love that about him.
Well, Cindy, let me thank you for being part of this iteration of Authors in Insight at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And I know on behalf of thousands of people, I thank you for your leadership, but also for you and the Senator letting so many into your life, sharing so much of your family and your principles with all of us in the world. And that it continues to be an inspiration every day for so many people. So thank you. And again,
thank you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you, Josette. And I really appreciate you doing this and being a part of our Institute and being a part of the future of what some great leaders that have and will come from the Institute. And certainly all the work that you have done around the world, because you have been a complete inspiration to me through the years, and I can't thank you enough for that. I'm very proud to call you my friend.
Right back at you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cindy McCain.